This is Caribbean Tea. With me from St. Vincent, Kendall Morgan. In Georgetown, Guyana, Dennis Chabral. And I am Vivian Williams in New York.
I'm journalist Kendall Morgan in Kingstown, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Dr. Vivian Williams is a Guyanese attorney practicing in the United States and the Caribbean. And Dennis Chabral is a journalist in Georgetown, Guyana. Today's inaugural program looks at the likely impact which the Trump administration's latest policy pronouncements may have on Caribbean-United States relations. Joining us to help expound on this matter is the historical economist and principal of the University of the West Indies Five Islands campus in Antigua and Barbuda, Professor Justin Robinson.
Now we are dealing with a multipolar world where power, wealth, influence is now in multiple locations.
An economist, a professor of corporate finance, and a director with vast public service. He served as a member of the Fiscal Responsibility Mechanism in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as director of the Jamaica Money Market International, and as chairman of the Caribbean Information and Credit Rating Service Limited.
Professor Robinson, who is also a pro vice chancellor at the UWI, has been hailed by colleagues as an expert in regional corporate affairs. The Vincentian-born professor served for a number of years at the UWI's Cayville campus in Barbados, including as executive director of the Cayville School of Business. He is also a former chairman of the Barbados National Insurance Service and a former member of the board of the Barbados Central Bank. Welcome, Professor Robertson, and can we begin with your overall thoughts on the general policy direction of the Trump administration and why we in the Caribbean should be concerned?
I tend to view what is happening through the lens of someone who is something of a financial historian and looking at trends over relatively long periods of time. And my perspective is the Caribbean has to rapidly have a mental shift to recognize the fact that we are now in what I would call a multipolar world. Much of our modern experience post-independence has been driven by that consensus since 1944, post-World War II. A lot of that driven by the United States, where we had this multilateral system, the UN, World Bank, IMF, a lot of these bodies that we deal with internationally. Then we had a Cold War situation, and then we moved to more of a unipolar world. But now we are dealing with a multipolar world where power, wealth, influence is now in multiple locations. The United States really dominated the globe post-1944. Our reality now is China, other parts of Asia, Europe, have all emerged. And I think the United States is adjusting to a new reality where it's not the only player in town. It's not as dominant relative to others. And the responses of the Trump administration, I view as one response in the United States to how does the US positioning itself in a multipolar world where the US leading Europe really dominated the globe. Now, what are the implications to come more directly? So I think we have to have that mental shift. That this is now a game with, it's now a very competitive league. You know, it's Saturday and many of us in the Caribbean watch English Premier League. It's no longer just about Man City and others. This is a very competitive league. How do we position ourselves in that. And I think that's a mental shift we have to make. Now, in terms of more directly to your question, for reasons of geography, we are proximate to the United States. Our history, we come out of a very similar experience to the United States. Language, we are very much in what I call the United States' immediate influence zone. We are small, but we are definitely, I mean, the time when I was a much younger person was we are in the US backyard. So we are very much in their influence zone. And I don't think it's a reality that we can escape. My broader view is maybe shaped by the late Barbadian statesman Errol Barrow. Friends of all, satellites of none. I think we have to learn to dance in that space in a very realistic way. If I look at the Trump administration, what I see is an administration that brings a very transactional approach to international relations. And I think Caribbean countries, as they engage the Trump administration, need to be in that mindset rather than relying on traditional diplomatic approaches. What is in it for the US? How can we partner with you to further your interests while defending our own? I think is the only approach that is likely to have to pay any dividends with an administration that is very transactional and is adopting a particular stance as the US adjusts and is figuring out this new global reality. So that's my sort of maybe overall initial perspective. And I hope I've answered your question.
In that regard, and before my co-anchors come in, um, it does suggest that it would help if the Caribbean countries have some sort of bargaining chip to use in any negotiations with the US. What is there that we can leverage as a Caribbean, or do we just have to accept whatever the US puts on the table?
But I don't think one should go into a negotiation thinking you have to accept whatever is put on the table. But we should also recognize the power differentials. You know, this is still a very large, powerful country. So I don't think we can escape our geography and our history. I think it's for us to be extremely pragmatic, understanding what they want, because this is a very transactional administration so far. They are not into traditional diplomatic niceties and the way it was done before. I think if we go in with that perspective, we're just going to get killed completely. I think we have to understand where they're coming from, what they want, and well, what can we do for you to facilitate your agenda while facilitating our own? And I think that will, but I mean, I think we are frank, we don't really have any big bargaining chips, but that doesn't mean that you just have to lie down and play dead and take whatever is happening to you. Because people want, I mean, countries have interests that they want to pursue. This administration has a particular approach to pursuing these interests. And I think we have to be very pragmatic and open-minded in how we do this kind of, what is going to be a complicated dance? You know, these are elephants dancing, we are ants. How do you not get crushed?
I think one of the things we probably have to take into consideration is the fact that while countries at large have interests, sitting governments do have interests, and among those interests is the maintenance of power. Sometimes we see at all costs. How do you envisage small Caribbean governments balancing their own interests to maintain power with preserving and promoting the ideals that we have become accustomed to, things such as freedom of expression, freedom of movement, democracy, and basic human rights? Can we find ourselves, for instance, in a position where we are transacting away those rights in order to secure ourselves, that is, the parties preserving themselves in government?
Yeah, I mean, very interesting question, and it maybe goes close to the heart of some of my own concerns about how this what might be the short, medium, and long-term implications of this particular policy stance. So, if the administration in the US takes a very belligerent approach to things, a very anti-rights approach to this, does this make some governments or some countries feel they have a license to pursue different policies? Because if the United States, America first, dealing a certain way, if you take a global sense, does the US have any moral authority given their current stance that if China makes a grab for Taiwan, can they even pull a coalition to stop it? So one of the things that we have to be concerned about is whether this particular stance legitimizes a different approach to relationships across countries. I mean, in my lifetime, for example, when the US, after 9/11, when you had the invasion of, you had the war with Afghanistan, then Iraq, the US felt compelled because that's the way things were done then, that they sought a UN resolution. They sought to work through multilateral bodies. Are we now going to see the multilateral bodies marginalized? If the US goes down this road, then other countries can seek to pursue their interests outside of the multilateral institution, and that's not in our interest. Closer to home, I expect the administration to try to pick off Caribbean governments one by one with a carrot and stick approach. And sometimes opposition, and in some cases, opposition parties might be vulnerable to that. In some cases, it might be government. So I think that's something we have to prepare for, that a particular political party, whether an incumbent or an aspiring opposition party, is willing to pursue a particular agenda in return for US support, which advances that party's political agenda. I think that is within the realm of possibility in the Caribbean and the wider world.
I want to take up from where Professor Robinson points out that there is, in fact, more of a cultural integration between the United States and the Caribbean. And that sort of integration is significant. I think it is part of the pillar, one of the pillars that is guiding the way the administration is operating. If, for instance, Caribbean countries were to put up some resistance to the United States and what it might want in any sort of negotiations with them, the United States has many ways that it could sort of force countries to, for instance, accept their nationals who are deported and to sort of comply with what it wants. And it could, in fact, impose sanctions where it sees sanctions necessary, cut back on aid, and all of that. That, in essence, would result in a significant impact on the countries that are sanctioned or the countries that the US modify its relations with. If, for instance, another powerful country, let's say Russia or China, were to impose a sanction on one of the Caribbean countries, that would not have the same weight as, say, visa sanctions for a Caribbean country. And that is largely because of the depth of integration, cultural and other forms of integration that create a kind of a dependency on the United States. And I think that that is one of the strength that the United States is coming into this here. And I know that the professor indicated that there is sort of a multipolar sort of global system that we're shifting back to. But I'd like to hear from him whether, in fact, the manner in which this Trump administration is implementing its new policy and the new policy direction that it is going is, in fact, an indication that the United States is trying to assert itself not as a member or an element in a multipolar power system, but as the center of gravity in global power and influence.
The United States, the Trump administration is internalizing the extent to which the world has shifted, and they are trying to assert themselves and, and to really reimpose themselves as this totally dominant power. I mean, and that's why I say it is one response to the United States trying to adjust to this new multipolar world. So, the United States just accounts for like around 6% of the globe's population. But they have had an outsized influence on global trade. So let me give you an example, just some data. So in 1944, and World War II, the US was about 6% of the world population. China, 22%. Europe, around 22%. If we move forward to today, US is around 4% of the world population, China, 18%. But the remarkable shifts are in the economies. So in 1944, the US accounted for 27% of total global GDP output across the world. The European Union, another 30%. If you come forward today, 2024, China has moved from 5% to about 17%, an equal share with the European Union. If we look at global trade, China had less than 1% of global trade in 1944, whereas the US had 25% and Europe 40%. 2024, US is 10% of global trade compared to 25% in 1944. China has moved from less than 1% to 15%. So yes, the US is now trying to say, well, we have been, the view of the Trump administration is that we have played silly in this global game. We've been too friendly, we've been too open, we've facilitated everyone, they've all surged ahead, and now they're trying to play catch up, hence the robust stance. So I think you are spot on. They are trying to figure out their way in this new multipolar world. And the stance of the Trump administration is that we don't want any multipolar world. We want to be the dominant player, but I think it's way too late. I think they have lost this battle, and which is where I say I come from it from the perspective of someone who does a lot of financial history. I would argue that coming out of the Industrial Revolution, starting in England, Europe. So, if you were to take a course in economic history, Kendall, they like to show this graph that as far back as we can go, until about 1500, we had a multipolar world. China was rich, India was rich, there were European city-states. But once you had that Industrial Revolution, the term they use in economic history, what they call the Great Separation. Europe just went way ahead of everybody. On the graph, it just goes off. The US was an extension of that. So my view is that once China, India, and those places industrialize, they are going to be major global players. So I think the last 500 years has been an aberration, an odd period in the long span of human economic history. So I think they're just fighting against historical realities. Where are the world's people? If you look at people, the world's people are in Africa. In 1944, Africa had about 9% of the world population. Now they have about 18%. Europe, China, all of these countries are facing declining populations. So I think you are spot on, but I think they are fighting against a losing battle. As a Vinci boy growing up in St. Vincent, I would say that they're swimming against a very strong tide. Just think of it anecdotally, Kendall. If 50 years ago you wanted to see a fancy airport, a fancy piece of engineering, where would you have looked to see it from? The US or somewhere in Europe. Now, if you want, I mean, if you go through an airport in China or Abu Dhabi or whatever, Dubai, and then you come back through JFK, you sort of like, as young people say, JFK looks so ghetto as an airport compared. You know what these guys are doing in technology? You know, one of my colleagues, Guyanese guy, Professor Richard Drayton, is based in the UK. Richard just shared a couple of weeks ago on his Facebook page, which I think should be required reading. His page should be required reading. There's an Australian research institute that puts out every year what are the 25 leading emerging technologies in the world. And in their most recent edition, China is leading on 23 of those 25 technologies. So I think they are swimming against a serious tide.
I just wanted to, Professor, zero in on one of the specific actions by the Trump administration, the threat to impose visa restrictions on the officials from governments, government officials of those countries that benefit from the Cuban medical teams. They're claiming that it's forced labor, but we know that a number of Caribbean countries benefit from the expertise that these trained medical professionals bring. Have you considered the likely impact on the region? And one of the things that the Caribbean region has been doing quite a bit was to push for the end of U.S. sanctions and on Cuba, and to continue to show solidarity with Cuba as a Caribbean neighbor. Is that friendship, that bond, that solidarity likely to come under strain that the Caribbean countries may find difficult to bear?
Yeah, very difficult issue. But again, once Rubio was appointed foreign secretary, we could expect this shift in policy. Huh? I mean, Rubio is of Cuban descent. This is a very, I mean, I did my master's degree in Florida. This is a very important issue there. So it's no surprise in a way that that has risen. And I also think the choice of Rubio also points to a pivot and a certain focus and stance in Latin America. So Caribbean countries are going to face a lot of pressure to examine their relationships with Cuba and Venezuela. I think people are very naive if they don't expect a very robust policy coming out of the United States around our relationship with Cuba and Venezuela, as I expect the administration to seek to really shape and push a U.S. policy, which might be heavily based around notions of regime change and in those countries. So I think the Cuban salvo is just the first one. I anticipate a similarly robust policy as it relates to Venezuela. Clearly, a number of Caribbean countries have very close relationships with Cuba, and Cuban medics are very important players. I think I was reading a story that in Grenada, if they didn't have their Cuban healthcare workers, they would be down to a single anesthesiologist in the entire country or something like that. So again, I think it's something you have to negotiate very delicately. This is a very important issue for parts of the Republican base, and I expect it to be central to the foreign policy of the administration. And I think, as Vivian said, the U.S. has a lot of cards to play. I don't think this is a trivial issue. So I think we have to negotiate that. I think we have to express the importance of it to our health systems as they are, the consequences for us if we were to have this in a very abrupt way. But it is a reality that we're going to have to try to negotiate, but this is not going to go away. This is a very difficult issue because this is a very important issue for this administration. And it's not just going to be Cuba. It's going to be at least Venezuela as well.
I would like to hear from you your perspective about the warning by the United States to Venezuela that if they continue to engage in provocative actions against oil-producing vessels offshore Guyana, there will be consequences. What, in your estimation, can be some of these consequences?
And that's a good example of this friends of all, satellites of none, and why our politicians, diplomats have to be very skillful. You have to really, you really need that Caribbean rhythm. You have to learn to dance to different beats. So the stance of this administration is probably quite helpful for Guyana in terms of protecting itself from the threat from Venezuela around that oil wealth. Now they've become very heavily embedded with the Cuban workers, so it's not in our advantage in that case right now. That's clear. So I think we have to be very careful how we negotiate, because you don't want to throw out the baby with the bad water. There are opportunities from the stance of this administration. As they pursue their interests, there are going to be aspects of their interests that are in sync with ours. And my view is always, this is what people get paid big money for, to be politicians and diplomats and foreign secretaries, that they need to understand the new landscape and how to dance within it and how to advance the interests of their nations and protect the downside. There are no simple answers. This job is not easy, but if it was easy, then anybody could do it. And the people who are in it need to have the skill. It's easy to bat on a flat wicket. Guys have to show that they can bat when the ball is moving, and this is a new environment, and our guys have to show that they can bat.
I hear from Professor Robinson a very important evolution in global affairs. The US is flexing its muscles. It is testing the multipolar world that we're in, and the emerging powers in various parts of the world. This flexing of muscle is really to assert US dominance. And the US has two major uh, cards that it could play and play well. One is the strong and deep cultural and social integration of various countries with the United States, and the other is the integration of the financial systems of many countries, particularly the Caribbean, with the United States. And therefore, those are fronts that the United States, that countries are vulnerable in negotiating with the United States. The key issue then would be to what extent the United States would approach this by simply dealing with individual Caribbean countries in a bilateral level, rather than a regional level where there is likely to be stronger and a more resilient regional approach to this, as against the sort of bilateral relations where it could sort of extract uh, what it wants from countries individually. And to what extent I'd want to ask Professor Robinson that the region ought to be aware of this, and what therefore might be reforms that CARICOM itself may need to consider in order to deal with this new reality that faces it.
Okay, again, not an important and interesting perspective. From what I've seen of the administration so far, I don't expect them to take a CARICOM approach. That doesn't seem to be their style. There's a certain disdain for regional, multilateral type bodies. And again, these guys are very clever, skilled negotiators. So they know that their hand is weaker in a regional multilateral setting. So I quite anticipate that this is going to be very bilateral. They're going to go to Guyana and seek to, because Guyana, the Venezuela thing is their top issue. Their sovereignty is at stake. So they're going to go to Guyana. Migration, immigration might be a big thing for somebody else. So I think whatever it is CARICOM does, it needs to be done behind closed doors, and see to what extent, as the US seeks to negotiate with the member nations, in a bilateral area, in a bilateral manner, that there has been sufficient solidarity behind closed doors that even though people are being spoken to individually, that they're singing from the same hymn sheet. I'm not exactly optimistic about that reality because, again, the different islands have different interests. I mean, nobody has the issue that Guyana has. I mean, Guyana's very sovereignty, territorial integrity as a country is under threat from Venezuela. Are they going to walk away from helping settling that issue? I don't think you can ask them to, but then you have places like St. Vincent, which are very deeply embedded in relationships with Venezuela and Cuba that are going to come under a lot of pressure. I mean, is Guyana going to show solidarity with St. Vincent and risk endangering the integrity of its territorial border? So we have to be very practical and pragmatic about these things. You know, I mean, you have to have your principles. You have to stand for something, or you can fall for anything. But I think within there's a lot of scope where you have to deal with the reality of small island, very vulnerable nation states. So I expect the bilateral approach to be the dominant approach. I mean, Trump, the administration doesn't even really speak the EU as a group. I mean, it's dealing with individual countries. So why would we expect it would carry come?
Certainly want to thank Professor Justin Robinson for joining us on this premiere edition of the weekly podcast Caribbean Tea. Any final thoughts before we wrap, Professor?
Yeah, well, certainly thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to engage the Caribbean and its diaspora. It's certainly a new reality that we are in that's really going to test our diplomatic skill. I think this calls for strong values and principles, but very cool, skill, pragmatic diplomacy that is grounded in our reality and the reality of the dominant power that we are negotiating with, and that we also seek to exploit opportunities, because it can be very easy to really get drowned in a sea of negativity. But the administration is here. This is the legitimate popular choice of the American people, our powerful neighbor with whom we are deeply intertwined in so many ways. And we have to learn to live with this new reality and find ways to protect our interests and even further our interests. So I don't think we should get too mired in negativity. We should be looking for the opportunities while protecting our interests and values.
Professor C. Justin Robinson, University of the West Indies Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Five Islands campus in Antigua and Barbuda, our guest this week on Caribbean Tea.